3 years after the monumental milestone of culture that was the debut of Pocket Monsters, Game Freak released a sequel pair of games for the Nintendo Game Boy Color, Pokémon Gold version and Pokémon Silver version. And yes, you heard me correctly. In my opinion, Black 2 and White 2 was not the first pair of sequels in the main series. For all intents and purposes, Gold and Silver are direct sequels to Red and Blue. And this starts to become increasingly obvious the more you look into the derivative nature of Generation 2's characteristics. Now, when I say derivative, I don't mean it in a bad way, despite the negative connotation that's often assigned to that word. In fact, I would venture to say that deriving elements from the first generation allowed the developers to, well, develop the already existing ideas into even better manifestations of their former selves and more successfully execute on the promising aspects of the previous games. Moreover, to further defend the similarities between the first two generations of Pokémon, we needn't look anywhere else than the context behind their release. If we're to earnestly look at these games in full retrospect, it's important to recognize the situation in which Game Freak found themselves following the resounding success of Pokémon's premier titles. Believe it or not, before Red and Green came out, Game Freak was not the notable developer that they are today, and this project was a huge financial gamble. Needless to say, when Pocket Monsters almost immediately became not just a sales juggernaut, but a global phenomenon that shaped a generation of entertainment, Game Freak did well to withstand the shock of having the eyes of the world on them and capitalize on this opportunity to transform their passion project into a cross-media franchise rich with spin-offs, merchandise, and television over the next couple of years. Much less worry about continuing the IP with another project of the same scope. But now that they had a platform in the industry, an ocean of possibilities instantly opened up to them, and with the entire gaming community's undivided attention, their next move would be crucial in establishing the legacy of the series. Not only did they lack the hindsight that sweaty video essayists like me have on the Pokemon formula, they also didn't have a formula because, little did they know, the formula was being built with Gold and Silver. For all they knew, these might have been the last games in the series. Luckily, that didn't turn out to be the case, but I sometimes think about what the world will be like with only 2 generations of Pokemon. All I know is that it would be a world without Clobopus, and I don't think I'd have the constitution to live in such a world. With that being said, there are a copious amount of designs out of the 100 new Pokemon they introduced in Gold and Silver that would make life worth living on their own. In fact, I'm going to take a leap here and say that the Generation 2 roster of Pokemon has the best designs in the series. Of course, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but I think there's something to be said about the elegantly simple composition of some of these critters. I might be wrong here, but I would hypothesize that the pixelated nature of these sprites forced them to use bigger and simpler shapes, which ultimately resulted in a more minimalistic style. Obviously, the previous generation was even more pixelated, so this roster certainly isn't unique in its minimalism, but there's a certain je ne sais quoi about these designs that really captures the essence of what we love about befriending these creatures in the first place and makes you say, yeah, alright, now that's a Pokémon! Not convinced? Well, allow me to introduce you to my son. He doesn't like sudden movements, but you can gently whisper compliments to him. He loves it when I do that. Or how about Centret? Come on, give the poor guy a boost. He's just trying to get a better view. Hoot Hoot's hoots are a hoot, and Ledian's cute to boot. A water and electric type? Whose side are you on, Lantern? Look how happy Togetic is. Oh, he's just a little guy. 3 different colors? I wonder what it's like to be struck by that tail. I don't ever want to stop looking at Sudowoodo. I can't help it. I need to know what he's gonna do next. Sunkern's trying his best, you guys. Give him a break. Look at Quagsire trying to make a good impression. Aw, you two are precious. I love your costumes. Here, have a 3 Musketeers. Ooh, you're a spooky little guy, aren't you? Uh-oh, you're gonna get me. Oh, yes, you are. Wobbuffet just wants to be loved. God, I don't know what I'd do with myself if anything happened to him. Gligar, I didn't know you were coming to the party. Oh, settle down before you hurt yourself. At the end of the day, Quillfish is just misunderstood. If anyone lays so much as a finger on Shuckle, I will be furious with them. I want to start a podcast with Heracross. Circle Bear! Keep on keeping on, Megcargo. You know I'm always rooting for you. Skarmory's so cool! A lot of people say they'll never give up, but they don't actually mean it. Houndour means it. Kingdra's so cool! Donphan's just trying to put food on the table, man. Give him some slack. Sometimes the sequel is just as good as the original. Look at those prongs! And the best part is that they didn't just replace the old with the new. You can still see most of the original 151 Pokemon on your journey, which brings the total number of national Pokedex entries up to 251. Of course, that number has been more than quadrupled since then, but don't be fooled. I would argue that completing the Pokedex was as hard as it's ever been in Gold and Silver, because it required one of the kids to bite the bullet and take second place on Christmas morning in order to get the version exclusives. Although I think we can agree that Lugia is just as cool as Ho-Oh. Which reminds me that these games actually set a precedent for the rest of the series here by putting the legendaries on the box art rather than the starters. And yeah, that was kind of a no-brainer. Now that they could count on having a shorter delay for the international release, Game Freak could just go forward with the plan of dropping Gold and Silver as a pair and then Crystal as the third enhanced version a year later. And it would be weird if Totodile got special treatment over Cyndaquil and Chikorita. What, you think you can just get anything you want in this world if you throw a big enough tantrum, you little crocagator brat? But hey, speaking of changes introduced in Generation 2, let's speak on some damn changes introduced in Generation 2. First of all, Gold and Silver features the most significant change of the type chart in the history of the series with the addition of the Dark and Steel types, which acted as a much-needed remedy to the opacity of the Psychic type. And while we're on the topic of the battle system, Gen 2 also introduced Held items, which exponentially increased creative potential for team building. And the newly added XP bar gives you a front row seat to how painfully slow the members of your team grow to be the hardened war machines that you will them to be. We also got the hugely influential Special Split. And no, I'm not talking about the physical Special Split in Gen 4. The Special Split refers to the separation of the Special Stat into Special Attack and Special Defense, which finalized and established the stat paradigm that Pokemon still uses to this day. What in the world would we do without the day-night cycle? Oh, but don't think for a second that I forgot about the introduction of gender and breeding. Have you ever had a dream that Machamp was actually green? Well, thanks to Gold and Silver, that dream is a reality. Okay, no joke, when I was recording footage for this video, I actually encountered a full odds shiny Tentacruel and caught it. This is Gen 2, by the way, so the odds were 1 out of 8,192. Oh my god, thank Christ there's more bag space. By the way, can we talk about how useless of a concept the Pokegear is? I mean, the phone call mechanic was kinda useful for what little plot there was in the game, but we already had a map in Gen 1, and the radio was just an excuse to wake up Snorlax using a different method. You know what's not useless, though? The fact that this guy's name is Ralph. Geez, Game Freak, at this rate you'll be a regular J.R.R. Tolkien. How about those quirky Pokeballs made from apricorns, eh? I'll tell you about them later. I have a dealer in Azalea Town. Wait, Azalea Town? Azalea is a flower, not a color. Well, Tozus, I have a feeling we're not in Kanto anymore. That's right, Gold and Silver take place in the beautiful region of Johto, where the trees are rocks and the rocks are endangered. Johto is based on the Kansai region of Japan, featuring faithful references to traditional Japanese architecture, as well as more diverse natural environments than what we saw in Kanto, such as the frosty ice path and the system of whirlpools separating Olivine and Cianwood City. And of course, with a brand new region comes a brand new set of gym leaders, each specializing in different types than the ones in Kanto. At this point in the series, every type now had a gym leader representative except the Dark type, which would not actually be represented until 20 years later with the gym leader Piers in Sword and Shield. Now, we did have a Dark-type representative in the generation prior with Sun and Moon's Nanu, but he was technically a kahuna, not a gym leader. Nonetheless, even though Johto didn't have a Dark-type gym leader, it did have a Dark-type specialist in the form of the Elite Four member Karen. And after you defeat the Elite Four and the champion, Gold and Silver launches you into what is widely considered to be the greatest post-game content the series has ever seen. That's right, following your victory at the Pokemon League, you get to go to Kanto. Sorry, let me rephrase that. You get to embark on a whole other quest for 8 more gym badges by challenging each and every gym from Kanto. Sorry, let me rephrase that. The entire region of Kanto is in this game for you to explore and discover to your heart's content. Let me tell you, surfing to the east of Newbark Town after getting the Rising Badge and hearing this guy tell me that I had just taken my first steps into Kanto was mind-blowing as a kid. I was like, so you're telling me that the frontier of the region that I spent all my time traveling through in Red and Blue was in my backyard all along? And getting to take the SS Aqua to Vermilion City after my epic battle with Lance at the Indigo Plateau and then challenge Lieutenant Surge for a 9th gym badge was a sequence of events that my 9-year-old brain could barely handle. It felt like I was only halfway through the game after becoming champion because of this incredible opportunity to collect twice as many gym badges as any other game in the series would allow, and then proceed to climb Mount Silver only to find mother-loving Red at the peak. Or should I say mother-abandoning. Either way, this battle is a clash of epic proportions, undeniably worthy of being among the most significant boss fights in the series' history. It's just one of those iconic moments that makes me love the second generation of Pokemon even more, not to mention the whole post-game quest through the Kanto region that leads up to it. And yet, while Kanto is one of Gold and Silver's greatest strengths, It's also their biggest weakness. I've spent most of this video giving nothing but praise to these games because I genuinely love them, as do millions of other Pokemon fans. And although I truly believe that they deserve every bit of said praise, the unfortunate reality is that the sophomore generation of Pokemon is far from perfect. And it turns out that when we start to consider all of the problems that plague Gold, Silver, and Crystal, virtually all of it can be traced back to the same underlying issue. After extensive deliberation on the matter, I've come to the realization that Gold and Silver's connection to Generation 1 is the source of all of its major flaws. These games are living in the shadow of their predecessors, and their over-reliance on Kanto is holding them back from achieving their full potential in three main regards: story, Pokedex, and identity. The story in Generation 2 is a continuation of Gen 1. After Giovanni is defeated by Red at the Viridian Gym and disbands Team Rocket out of shame, the Pokemon world is freed from their evil. But after 3 years of peace, a new rendition of Team Rocket led by a cohort of executives starts wreaking havoc on Johto in the pursuit of reclaiming their dominance as an organization and finding their disgraced leader Giovanni. But that's exactly the problem. Giovanni is disgraced. He doesn't want to return and show himself to his subordinates. The entire Team Rocket plot in Gold and Silver ends with an anticlimactic whimper in the Goldenrod radio station when you confront this pathetic excuse for a boss battle and watch him desperately fiddle with the equipment in the hopes of getting an actually good villain to notice him. I wasn't actually sure what to do after this point in the game as a kid because I thought that surely he wasn't the final obstacle. Surely a random, unnamed Team Rocket executive wasn't the finale of this story's conflict. But alas, he was. And it's all because Game Freak tried to continue a story that didn't need continuing. A story that Generation 1 already told 3 years prior. What's more is that the big showdown against Team Rocket from a gameplay perspective is monotonously, relentlessly dull. The player is forced to claw their way through grunt after bumbling grunt in the Mahogany headquarters, followed by the Goldenrod Underground, followed by the radio station in a mind-numbingly linear path defined by an army of exclusively Cantonian rodents. And the thing is, despite the underwhelming story, this still could have been an enjoyable experience if the actual process of battling through the grunts was remotely interesting. They could have had the player traverse an environment like the Sylph Company building from Red and Blue, which was made interesting by interweaving all of the different floors via warp panels. But instead, we got bland hallways devoid of any misdirection or nuance because the developers spent so much of their time and software space on Kanto. In the era of the Game Boy Color, where precious cartridge data was limited, the greatness of Gold and Silver's postgame unfortunately came at the price of diminishing the game. And that's the real tragedy here. There are aspects of the story that have so much potential, like witnessing all of the changes that Kanto has undergone over the last 3 years, such as the volcano that ruined Cinnabar Island and the changing League personnel, or the rival character being introduced as a violent thief and developing into a formidable trainer who acknowledges the power of training your Pokemon with love and affection. But because of Gen 2's obsession with Kanto, so much of that potential is ultimately squandered. The rival never truly completes his story arc, and you get the sense that he's just frustrated and confused more than anything else by the end of it all. It's really awesome that Kanto is in these games, but at times, it seems like a shell of its former self. Most of the areas, albeit necessarily, have been reduced to a hollow reduction of what they once were, and it makes me question if its inclusion was even worth it to begin with, especially when we consider the Pokedex. The roster of Pokemon that was introduced in Gold and Silver is what I can only describe as paper mache. It's beautifully artistic and wonderful to look at, and it will collapse if I look at it too sternly. Now, this isn't theoretically a bad thing. If all of the Pokemon in the roster were equally underpowered, then the game would be balanced. But once again, the suffocating presence of Kanto looms over the Johto Pokedex and reveals just how helplessly weak it actually is. Half of these Pokemon are borderline unusable due to their disadvantageous stat distributions and evolutions, or lack thereof. And the Pokemon that are usable are either evolutions of Kanto Pokemon or new Pokemon that you can't get until you go to Kanto. Every single Johto gym leader uses Kanto Pokemon, and only half of their aces are from Johto. And half of those are evolutions of existing Pokemon from Gen 1. If you think Game Freak's Kanto pandering is bad now, believe me when I say that it was even worse in Generation 2. During my playthrough of Crystal to get footage for this video, the deeper I got into it, the more I saw the face of Kanto seeping into nearly every aspect of the game until it became almost unrecognizable as an individual title. And this is the worst of the first generation's crimes against Gold and Silver. It wasn't the half-baked story. It wasn't even the debilitated Pokedex. No, the most egregious of Kanto's sins was stealing the second generation's identity. Generation 2 continuously and persistently borrows characteristics from the first generation to such an extent that it sacrifices its own autonomy. Team Rocket is from Kanto. Nearly a fifth of the Johto Pokedex are evolutionary continuations of Pokemon from Kanto. The Gen 2 Pokemon League is in Kanto. Even from the moment you start the game, the first generation's influence is undeniably present because it's not Professor Elm that greets you at the beginning, it's Professor Oak from Kanto. This isn't just a problem with the games, by the way. If you look on the Bulbapedia page for the Pokemon anime, it lists the official subdivisions of the show and organizes each season into series. And sure enough, the original series of the anime consists of seasons 1 through 5, which includes everything from Kanto and Johto. Literally every other region gets its own series, except for Johto, which is grouped together with the Indigo League. I can't think of a more perfect illustration of Gen 2's identity crisis than that. But that's enough negativity for now. Let's talk about Pokemon Crystal, the enhanced version of Generation 2 that came out only a year after Gold and Silver. Pokemon Crystal was the first game in the series to have the option of playing as a female character, which is an addition that I think we can all agree is a positive one. It also added cute little animations for when the player encounters a Pokemon that adds so much personality to each of the creatures you come across on your journey. Unfortunately, the Ampharos line is unobtainable in Pokemon Crystal, which is a decision that I will never understand, but we also got the introduction of the Battle Tower, which adds just that little bit more to the post-game content, an effort that's always appreciated. Alright, who wants to help me write a coming-of-age novel about Yucine? Overall, the second generation of Pokemon will always and forever be irreplaceably special to me. I mentioned in my Gen 1 retrospective that Pokemon Yellow was the first Pokemon game I ever finished. The first Pokemon game I ever played was Pokemon Silver. Despite their flaws, these games are oozing with charm, and I will always respect them for their ambition. Fitting 2 whole regions into a Game Boy game is impressive, and we really haven't seen anything like it in the series since. And the level of polish that went into Gold and Silver is incredible. Their 8-bit appearance is deceptively similar to Gen 1, but the quality of life features and mass elimination of bugs compared to Red and Blue is night and day. Pun intended and immaculately executed. At the beginning of this video, I said that the derivative nature of Gold and Silver's Kanto references actually works to their benefit. And although I spent quite a while arguing that Generation 1 was actually the source of most of their issues, I still stand by that. Gen 1 walked so that Gen 2 could run, and even though the echoes of Kanto rippled outward and ultimately bled out into almost every facet of Johto, Pokemon Gold, Silver, and Crystal created the formula that would define the legacy of Pocket Monsters moving forward. For these were the titles that stood on the shoulders of giants.